What could possibly be the reason Trump's doing what he's doing when it comes to Russia and Ukraine? Now, from a layman's perspective, Trump is giving everything to the Russian government, accepting their framing about Ukraine not being in NATO, accepting their framing they're not going to give up any land or do land swaps, pausing all cyber offensive operations against Russia. And on the other side, Ukraine has had one of its hands tied behind its back while it's trying to fight for its life by pausing U.S. weapons shipments. I've heard contradictory reports that he's actually restarted the weapon shipments, but the intelligence sharing, which is arguably the most important part, has stopped from the United States. I don't know how you can't really look at that without saying that Trump is just appeasing Putin. If he wasn't appeasing Putin and he actually goes through some of the things he's threatened on Truth Social, saying we're going to actually start going after Russian oil and implementing more banking sanctions. I don't know how else we can do this. I'm sure Joe Biden pulled out all the backstops for that, but maybe there's more to be had. I don't know. The only possible reason I can see Trump doing this is an attempt to break up the strategic alliance between China and Russia. The problem with this is Russia is very transactional. They only follow agreements as long as they feel it's in their interests. That's why famously the United States and Russia worked really hard to try to get rid of nuclear weapons around the world. And there's something to be said about Putin. When the Soviet Union fell, the Soviets were actually debating within the government as it was collapsing, saying, hey, should we just start giving our nuclear weapons away to countries around us just to destabilize the world and have the United States deal with that? Vladimir Putin was somewhat instrumental in not letting that happen. Maybe because he saw the gears of power turning and eventually he would be president and then eventually just the permanent president. So if we're going to go with the foreign policy idea of breaking up the strategic alliance between China and Russia, that would require a lot of concessions from the United States government to the point that Russia would see the United States as more of an ally than China would. And Russia gets a lot of their weapon systems from China. They're kind of keeping the Russians afloat. And Russia being locked out of the banking sector from the rest of the world, the EU is holding on to about $300 billion in Russian assets, and they've already ruled that they can take the interest from that. I would just take all of it if you really wanted to actually stick it to Russia. But my guess is they're waiting to see how the United States is trying to get Russia to come to the negotiating table. But this is what blows my mind. We're treating Russia with kid gloves, and we're actually playing hardball with the Ukrainians. It could turn to the point that Ukraine eventually is just like, hey, we're just going to turn into another Afghanistan for Russia. So a strategic pause might make sense for Russia to actually come to the negotiating table. And if Russia would switch sides to the United States, let's keep in mind Putin is a liar and he doesn't keep any of his agreements, but let's say he's in good faith, actually becomes a counterbalance for the United States to use against China. The thing that's nice about the world order, you can't invade your neighbors in an attempt to take land, unless you're Israel, then that's fine apparently. Putting the hypocrisy aside, China could say to Russia one day, hey, Siberia was technically ours, so we want it back. And they'll pick the most inopportune time, too, for the Russians. I think it makes more sense for the United States to be part of the European Union. Yes, they're freeloaders when it comes to our defense, but we also have a lot of intelligence sharing with one another, and it actually helps the United States overall just to keep an eye on everything. They call it the Five Eyes, so to speak. But at the end of the day, this would require us to trust Vladimir Putin and the Kremlin. The funny thing about the people in Beijing, even though they're technically our biggest adversaries as far as to be a strategic threat to the United States, they don't trust the people in Moscow either. So Beijing, that's literally owned by the Chinese Communist Party and not good people to be dealing with, say that they're a bunch of liars. I think we should look deep and hard before we would make a decision like this to be like, hey, the United States is now apparently trying to contain China by being friendly with the Russians. I mean, we do have a precedent for working with Russia as far as just like the enemy of my enemy is my friend. In World War II, they did help us defeat Germany. I'm aware that China is a bigger threat, but at the same time, we put a bunch of sanctions on Russia, and they're a huge exporter of food and energy, and that's what's kept them going. I mean, if you put the same sanctions on Beijing, then we're probably going to see like mass famine. Never mind the moral quandaries of doing this. That's why China is waiting to see what happens with Ukraine if they're going to invade Taiwan. They got a little dose of what happens if the world powers actually decide to work together and collectively work to prevent you from accessing the world trade. Because I don't want to live in a world where might equals right. This goes for the United States as well when it comes to Israel. I don't think Israel should be allowed to annex the West Bank. I believe in a two-state solution. Ironically, Russia believes in a two-state solution. I think that's more or less to tell the United States to fuck off. You guys are just as morally depraved as we are. And it's not above the United States to work with dictatorships. Saudi Arabia comes to mind, as long as it's in our strategic interest to do so. So I hope Trump isn't going with the pipe dream of just trusting Russia. Number one, that would require so much surrender from the United States to actually bring them into being friendly with us, because you'd have to give them a lot to see the United States as more friendly to them than China. Number two, Putin has a very long history of breaking ceasefires and lying his ass off. He told his supposed ally Xi Jinping, "Why would I invade Ukraine?" So he lied to his face. It was hilarious because the Chinese military knew that he was going to do this and they didn't really want to tell him because Xi Jinping has a long history of shooting the messenger. And three, I just think it's immoral. The Ukrainians are the aggrieved party here. And in 1994, when Bill Clinton took their nuclear weapons and gave them security guarantees, that should mean something.